Today we're going to be speaking about the life of Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu an. And today we're going to be speaking about his early life, his time in Mecca. We'll be speaking about his personality, the kind of person Umar radiallahu an was, his family background. We'll be speaking about, inshallah, how he accepted Islam, which is a story maybe some of you have heard before. And we'll be speaking about his life, generally speaking, in the city of Mecca. Of course, Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu an has many virtues and many positive things which we can mention about him radiallahu an. From them is that he is the second Khalifa of the Muslims. Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu an was once described by the Prophet ﷺ in such a manner that he said that if you walk down a path, shaitan takes the other path, because of the fear that the shaitan had for Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu an. And he was also known as Umar al-Faruq. And the word Faruq means the one who distinguishes, because Umar radiallahu an was somebody who would distinguish between truth and falsehood. And this was a name, just like Abu Bakr radiallahu anh was given the title As-Siddiq. It was a nickname that was given to Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anh. And Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anh was from the city of Mecca, as many of the companions were. In fact, the greatest of the companions, if you were to categorize them, the greatest companions were the ones who were from Mecca, and they made the hijrah. So if you were to categorize the companions, the greatest companions are the Muhajirun, and then those who were Muslims in Medina, the Ansar, are considered second tier. Of course, they're all considered companions of the Prophet ﷺ, and Allah is pleased with them all. But even amongst themselves, there's this categorization. So, for example, you would have the Muhajirun being given precedence or having a higher status as a group than the Ansar. And of course, the reason for this is because of the trials and tribulations that the Muhajirun went through in Mecca, which the Ansar didn't experience. And even though they went through those trials and tribulations, they still committed to their deen. They never left Islam. Even though they were going through these difficult times, many of them were persecuted, some of them were even killed. But they persevered, and they continued to believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the Ansar, of course, were the Muslims in Medina, and they were the ones who helped the Muslims who came from Mecca, and they gave them aid, they gave them money and financial assistance. They even gave them, houses so that they could stay in them. And the hypocrites only started to emerge in Medina, meaning after the Hijrah. We're not saying that they were only from the city of Medina itself. There were munafiqun from everywhere eventually when Islam spread. But what we're saying is that there were no munafiqeen in Mecca before the Hijrah. Why were there no munafiqeen in Mecca before the Hijrah? Nifaq, hypocrisy, only started to emerge after the Hijrah of the Prophet ﷺ from Mecca to Medina. Why was this the case? Anyone know? Any ideas? Sure, there's a Sirah class taking place here. Very good. In Mecca, if you told everyone you're a Muslim, but you weren't really a Muslim, what would happen? You'd be killed or persecuted. So it wasn't like for any benefit in Mecca. In Medina, if you told everyone you're a Muslim, there would be a worldly benefit because it's good for your image, because everyone's a Muslim. So people thought, if I say I'm a Muslim, then I can, get the benefits of being a Muslim, or get the glory, because they were only in it for the dunya, the hypocrites. Whereas in Mecca, if they said, I'm a Muslim, I'm with the Muslims, they're only going to be persecuted and made fun of and humiliated. So there was no worldly benefit for them. So this is, again, a praise that we give to the Muhajirun, the Muslims and the companions in Mecca. There was no nifaq there, because there was no benefit, worldly benefit of being a Muslim in Mecca in those days. And Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu an, he came from a respected family. His grandfather was somebody that the Quraysh used to go to when it came to judging between people. So he was known for his judgments. He was like a judge at the time. And Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anhu was born in the 11th year after the year of the elephant. So 11 years after the year of the elephant, which means how old was he compared to the Prophet ﷺ? 11 years younger than the Messenger of Allah alayhi salatu wasalam. And they say from his appearance, he was somebody who had a very striking appearance. There was his physical presence. They said that he was bold. They say he was somebody who was very tall. So much so that if you saw him in the distance, you would think he was riding a riding beast, like a horse or a camel. And then when you approached him, you would realize he's actually just very tall. So straight away, there's his striking presence. He would grow his mustache, and he would twirl the ends of his mustache, like it was like a habit he had. And so the ends of his mustache were like twirled. And as we mentioned, he was somebody who was known for his sternness. And there's a very interesting story which is mentioned, where he speaks about his upbringing. When he became the Khalifa of the Muslims, one day, when it was during Hajj season, he stood up and he gave a speech and he said, this area was an area where I used to tend to the sheep of my family and of my uncles and of my father. And sometimes my father used to beat me. And he's saying this in front of everyone, like in front of his followers, the Muslims. And he's the leader, you could say he's like the king. And he's talking about how he used to be beaten. And so some of the companions came to him afterwards, and it's like, it's not something that you would expect someone to say in a position of leadership, if you want to inspire. And they said, you didn't do yourself any favors, basically, when you said this. And Umar radiallahu anhu, he said, I said this because I wanted to remind myself that I'm not just a Khalifa, meaning I was thinking now that I am the Khalifa, this is the perception people are going to have of me, and I wanted to lower myself. And so it was out of humility he was mentioning some of these stories where he wasn't really, bigging himself up and praising himself. A person doesn't normally speak about the embarrassing stories that he has about himself, things that happened in the past when he was younger. You don't really talk about them, especially like in public, to everyone. But it was his humility that forced him to say these things. But it shows us an insight into his youth, into his younger years, how he was brought up. You could see from the statements he was making about his early life that he was treated in a very rough, stern manner by his uncles, by his father, that his father would beat him when he wouldn't do a good job of taking care of the animals. And so obviously this upbringing had an effect on Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anh. This mindset which he had, the way he used to think, the way he used to act, was as a result of how he was raised up. And of course, it was something which was of benefit to Islam and to the Muslims. So it really shows us the importance of tarbiyah and how we raise our children and what we do to raise our children, because whatever we do, whatever we say towards our children, it is going to mold them. It's like Play-Doh. Well, however you mold the Play-Doh, that's how it's going to be. That's how that's how it changes based on your actions and what you're doing to the Play-Doh itself. And a child is going to be similar. They're like putty in your hands in a way, because whatever you say, whatever you do is going to directly influence them and whoever they're socializing with, whoever they're with. So it's important for a person to understand the effect that your behavior has on the child, whether it's positive or negative. Everything you do, everything you say is going to be watched and going to be observed by your children, even when you don't think they're paying attention. I'm sure we've all experienced times when we don't think they're paying attention, and then they say something afterwards and you realize, I thought you weren't even listening. I didn't think you were even listening to our conversation that we were having, your mom and myself, or whoever it was. So it's something that one needs to pay attention to, and it has an effect. And subhanAllah, we want our young brothers and sisters to be sources of sadaqah jariyah for us, to make an effect and make a difference in the future. And one needs to be aware of this. So it really shows us the humility of Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anh. And somebody else also mentioned a description of Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anh. They said that إِذَا مَشَى أَسْرَى, that when he walked with purpose. He walked hastily. You know, when someone walks slowly, it doesn't look like he's really doing anything or going anywhere. But when one walks swiftly, he's going from one end of the masjid to the other, you know, swiftly. There's something going on. There's something happening. He has a purpose. He's doing something. He's going somewhere for a reason. And Umar ibn Khattab was like this normally. That's the way he would walk. He always walked with purpose, as if he's going to do something important. And so straight away you can imagine somebody in this manner. He's tall. You know, they say he had thick skin. Physically, he had thick skin. So he wasn't, fat or obese, but he was somebody who had thick skin. And he was somebody who was tall. When he would walk with a purpose, and he would walk quickly. They said, وَإِذَا تَكَلَّمَ أَسْمَعَ. And when he spoke, you listened. When he spoke, he was listened to. That was the kind of personality he was. You know, some people, they might speak and 10 people might speak over them. That's how they can't get a word out. Some people, they speak and everyone has to listen. Everyone pays attention to that person. Whether it's the voice or the things they say, you know, a person will be attentive. And they say, وَإِذَا ضَرَبَ أَوْجَعَ. That when he struck you, you would feel it. When he struck you, you would feel the strike but if he hit you, you would feel the pain. He wasn't somebody who would mess around. So, you know, this statement and this description really shows us what kind of person Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anhu was. And Umar ibn Khattab grew up in Mecca, and in fact, you know, even though we have these descriptions of Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anhu, somebody who had a respectable position, and he was somebody who was stern, somebody who was courageous, somebody who wasn't afraid to speak up, somebody who was maybe harsh at times. But in fact, he was somebody who was actually well educated. He was somebody who could read. Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anhu was somebody who was respected by the tribe, and he was also respected by the Quraysh. And he was a cousin of Abu Jahl, by the way. So him and Abu Jahl were related. And Umar ibn Khattab had a position amongst the Quraysh where he was like their diplomat. Meaning, if they needed someone to represent the Quraysh, whether it was in the Roman Empire, whether it was somewhere else, or to another tribe outside of Mecca, they would send Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anh to represent the Quraysh. So he had this senior position in Quraysh society, where people respected him to such an extent, they said, yeah, he's somebody who can, you know, positively represent the Quraysh in a good manner. He represents all that we are about. So again, you know, he was somebody who was very well spoken. And of course, when he did speak to other people as a diplomat for the Quraysh, you can understand him representing the Quraysh. He had to be somebody who could speak. He had to be somebody who was influential. And so Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anh was in this kind of environment where he was having this status, he was given this importance, and the people respected him. They also say physically he was somebody who, you know, had strength. And Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anh grew up in this kind of environment, and you know, he describes and he speaks about what he used to do. Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anh, he says, I used to tend livestock for Al-Khattab. You know, I used to tend to the livestock. And he mentions that he used to also be involved, and or companions mention he used to be involved in sports. They say he used to wrestle, and he used to ride horses, and he was a good horse rider. You know, he was into horsemanship, and this was something that he was very good at. And he was also keen to attend the fairs of the Arabs. So the Arabs would have their fairs and their celebrations, and they would celebrate their own local cultures and stuff. And he would always try to attend these also. And sometimes he would attend literary contests. So in those days, poetry, as we know, was something very popular. He would attend those and he would listen to the poetry. And in those days, they would use poetry similar to, for example, like how rap is used nowadays. You know, they have rap battles and people go back and forth. Poetry was used to humiliate another tribe. Poetry was used to promote your tribe. Poetry was used to raise the status of a person or to embarrass somebody. Poetry could have been the result of wars starting between tribes. So it was like a tool that was used, just like, maybe rap and other things are used today. And Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anhu was a trader. So he would travel to the Roman Empire, he would travel elsewhere, and he would buy and sell, and he would profit from this. So he was somebody who was a successful businessman. He made money as a result of this. He was one of the wealthy people in Mecca. He would travel to Syria in the summer, he would go to Yemen in the winter, and he had, as we said, a prominent position in the amongst the Arabs in Mecca. And he also had a level of knowledge as well about the Quraysh, about the culture, and he used to also judge between the Arabs regarding their disputes, similar to his grandfather. So he would judge between them, and he was known for his wisdom. As we said, he was eloquent, well-spoken, he was strong, he was somebody who was clear when it came to his speech. And this is Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anhu. And Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anhu, he never became a Muslim in the early days with Abu Bakr as-Siddiq and Ali radiallahu anhu and Uthman ibn Affan and the others. It took him a while. And when the Prophet ﷺ started calling people to the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Umar ibn Khattab had a hatred for the Prophet ﷺ and for the Muslims. And understanding now his background and his position and how he feels about the Quraysh, he had this hatred for the Prophet ﷺ and for the companions because he felt like they were disuniting and splitting the prestige and the nobility of the great Quraysh tribe. From his perspective, of course, hindsight now, Quraysh was nothing compared to what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala brought in the status of Islam. It raised the status of everybody, including the Quraysh. But at the time, it was a small group of people just rebelling. It seemed like they were rebelling against the norms of society. It didn't seem like they were going to be successful at the time because they were being persecuted. So Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anh sees what's happening, notices what's going on with the Muslims and how they're different with regards to their beliefs and the culture, or specifically the beliefs and their complete disregard of the idols, rejection of the idols, only worshipping one God, which, by the way, wasn't unusual in Mecca for two reasons. First of all, you did have some people in Mecca who believed in Allah and only worshipped Allah and never committed shirk. And they were called the Hunafa. Hunafa means those who only worshipped one God. And this is before the Prophet ﷺ came. You had, for example, the famous cousin of Khadija radiallahu anha. His name was Waraqa ibn Nawfal. Waraqa ibn Nawfal was somebody who was from Mecca. Obviously, he's the cousin of Khadija radiallahu anha. But he left Mecca when he was younger, and he traveled and he learned the scripture, and he basically learned about the Torah and the Injil, and he essentially became a Christian. And when he came back, he would tell the people not to worship the idols, and he worshipped Allah alone. He never committed shirk. So he was a Christian, but he never worshipped Isa alayhi salam. And this shows us that in those days, there were different factions and groups of Christians. So you had, for example, some of the Christians who, of course, used to worship Isa alayhi salam, the whole Trinity. Then you had others who didn't worship Isa alayhi salam, because when Christianity split, when Isa alayhi salam came, you had a group of people who went to one extreme and said Isa is God. You had another extreme, which were the Jews, who said Isa is basically nothing. What about his mother? His mother is just a nobody. But she was blessed with this child, is a miraculous child. They would say, no, it wasn't miraculous. They're basically saying she was an indecent woman. This is what the Jews say about Maryam alayhi salam. This is their position. So you have these two extremes. Islam, and the correct position, of course, was that he was a messenger of Allah. And Maryam alayhi salam was a righteous woman. And this was a miracle from the miracles of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this group, they were worshippers of Allah. They were basically Muslims. They worshipped Allah. And they believed Isa alayhi salam was a messenger of Allah. And there was a point in time where one of the Roman emperors, his name was Constantine. And Constantine was somebody who would persecute the Christians. One night he has a dream, and he basically has a dream of the cross, and the cross is leading his army, and he starts defeating other armies and other nations, and he realizes that he should be a Christian. That's the dream, that's the vision he has, and so he becomes a Christian. And the Roman Empire before this was pagan. So what happened? Constantine becomes a Christian, the Roman Empire becomes Christian, because he's a Christian now. And he has a council called the Council of Nicaea. In this council, he invites all the Christian scholars, saying to them, we need to decide about the fundamental beliefs of Christianity. What's going on? Is Jesus God? Is he a messenger of God? Is he a part of God? We need to figure out our aqidah, basically, as Christians. And so they cast a vote, and the majority of them voted that Jesus is considered to be a part of God, the Trinity. So they voted, basically. This is how they came to the decision. So all in favor. They said, okay, yeah, Jesus is God. Okay, yeah, well, this is the majority, democracy at its finest. So they said, yeah, we're going to believe Jesus is God. And so anyone who didn't believe Jesus was God was basically not a Christian. So what would happen to them? They'd be killed. So many of them fled. But they still had this essential belief. Salman al-Farisi radiallahu an, when he was on his search looking for the truth, he also became a Christian. And these types of Christians believed in Allah alone, and that Isa was a messenger. And so what Aqeel know for the point is, he was also from this kind of group, and he worshipped Allah alone. And of course, when the Prophet Muhammad came, he believed in the Prophet. Also, you have the brother-in-law of Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu an, who was also not him, but his father was also from the Hunafa, Sa'id ibn Zayd. Sa'id's father, was somebody who was from the Hunafa. He would tell people in Mecca not to worship the idols, and he would worship Allah alone. So you had these, and there were a few others as well. You had a number of them, a handful of them, who never used to worship the idols. So in Mecca, this belief of worshipping Allah wasn't unknown. Number one, because you had these people before prophethood worshipping Allah. This wasn't unusual. What was the other reason why it wasn't unusual? The Quraysh, believe it or not, also believed in the worship of Allah. They actually believed that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created the universe, He created the heavens and the earth and created everything. But they never worshipped Allah. So they had one aspect of belief, and in the Quran Allah says, وَلَئِن سَأَلْتَهُمْ, if you were to ask them, مَنْ خَلَقَ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ, who created the heavens and the earth, لَيَقُولُنَّ اللَّهِ, they would have said Allah. Meaning they believed in Allah, in the fact that He created the heavens and the earth. But when it came to worship, they used to worship Allah, and they used to also worship the idols. They used to commit shirk. And so when it would be asked of them, why do you do this? They would say, لِيُقَرِّبُونَ إِلَى اللَّهِ زُلْفَى, so we can become closer to Allah through them. The idols will help us get closer to Allah, so we make dua to the idols, and the idols are our intercessors between us and Allah, and they'll speak to Allah on our behalf, basically. We're too impure to speak to Allah directly, whereas of course this is shirk. And so, they were familiar with this concept of Allah, but they used to commit shirk. Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anh, living in this environment of shirk and idols, which had been going on for centuries now. Okay, it was something which is part and parcel of being an Arab and being from the Quraysh. He's seeing a group of people, a small group of people, a minority, going against the norms of society. And anywhere you see a group going against the norms of society, if the government, if the community, if the media, want to portray them in a negative manner, they can do it easily. Isn't it? That's something which is something which we've experienced, something which you guys have experienced. Because the riots and stuff that were happening here, and then some Muslims got involved, and the way they portrayed some of the Muslims that were getting involved in the riots by the Hindutva, etc. So the point is here, if you want to portray somebody as in a negative manner, it's not difficult to do if you have power on your side. And so Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anh resented them because they were dividing the Quraysh. How were they dividing the Quraysh? They were saying, don't commit shirk. Of course, they were saying, don't worship idols, worship Allah alone. And Umar radiallahu anh was a proud Qurayshi. So, for him, they were insulting the Quraysh. They were insulting everything he stood for. And he had this hatred for Islam. He had this hatred for the Muslims. And he would try to persecute the Muslims any chance he had. That there was a real hatred towards Islam and the Muslims. You had some who disliked the Muslims, but they wouldn't go so far as persecuted them. Then you had, of course, the ones who did persecute. Umar ibn Khattab, Abu Jahl and others. But of course, Umar ibn Khattab was somebody who was guided to Islam. And there's an interesting story. In fact, there are a few interesting stories about Umar ibn Khattab slowly sympathizing with Islam and the Muslims. There are 2 or 3 stories. And one of those stories is that he was beating his slave woman. He had a slave girl who was a Muslim. And he was beating his slave girl. And he was beating her non-stop. And he became tired and he sat down. And he said to his slave girl, as he's sitting down and resting, he says, don't think I've sat down because I have mercy for you. I've only sat down because I'm tired. And so the slave girl said to him, verily it's Allah who caused you to become tired, and it's Allah who's caused you to stop. This is how she's responding. And she's being beaten, by the way, like non-stop. Now Umar radiallahu anhu, we said he was somebody who was very stern. Somebody who was very principled in his beliefs of the Quraysh and of their whole culture. And nothing should get in the way of Quraysh. Seeing somebody in that state, speaking to him in that manner, how do you think it made him feel? He was somebody who, when he heard this, it actually impressed him. He was like, that's impressive. Like, I've been beating this slave girl non-stop, and the way she just spoke to me, I've got to give her respect for this. She's still firm in her belief. So, again, it shows us, if you stick to your principles and you stick to your belief, even enemies will start respecting you. They may not agree with you, but they'll know that you're somebody who, is unwavered when it comes to their belief, when it comes to their deen, for example. As Muslims, if we show our firmness in our deen, people, even if they don't agree with us, they'll have a sense of respect for us, like these people. And I'm sure you've heard people speak about this. That the Muslims, they don't waver when it comes to their deen. They don't make concessions. They don't, just go halfway. They go all the way. They're committed to their religion. Agree or not, or agree with them or don't agree with them, at least they're faithful to their religion. So Umar radiallahu anh, he's seeing this, and no doubt it had an effect on him. The way he's behaving and the way she's responded, and he must be thinking, this is like pointless. After everything I'm doing, she's still like adamant in her deen. And this was the belief of Allah that Allah placed in the companions in Mecca. And again, it shows us the status of the Muhajirun, the status of the Muslims in Mecca. So that's one incident. Another story is mentioned, and there are 2 more stories, so 4 altogether. The second story which is mentioned is of a dua that the Prophet ﷺ made. He said, "O Allah, guide whoever of these 2 people is more beloved to you." And another narration, "O Allah, guide Ahadul Umarain, one of the 2 Umars, whoever is more beloved to you." Umar ibn Khattab and Abu Jahl, his name was Amr. Umar ibn Khattab and Abu Jahl. Guide who you love more. Whoever is more beloved to you, guide them to Islam. And of course, Umar was more beloved to Allah. And this dua, of course, dua of the Prophet ﷺ came true. And this also shows us the importance of making dua and supplicating to Allah for guidance for yourself, guidance for your family, your children, your siblings, your parents, other people, relatives, etc. Friends maybe who are misguided, or maybe they're not Muslim, or they're people who are close to you, but you want them to be stronger in their deen. Dua is one of the most effective ways that a person can, make other people firm on top of showing good etiquette and trying to have a positive influence on them. The Prophet ﷺ supplicated, and his dua, his supplication came true. So this is the second story prior to him becoming Muslim. The third story is when the Hijrah to Abyssinia was taking place, around the 4th, 5th year of Hijrah. There were people who were making the Hijrah to Abyssinia, and there's a narration which mentions a woman who was preparing her camel to travel, packing her bags basically, to make their way to Abyssinia, to make the Hijrah to Abyssinia because of the persecution in Mecca. Umar ibn Khattab is walking by and he's noticing her pack her bags. And Mecca is a small city, maybe 1,000 people. Very small town, everyone knows each other. And Umar ibn Khattab, he looks at her, seeing her pack her bags, and he says to her, "Where are you going? Where are you traveling to?" And Umar ibn Khattab, when he asks this, the woman says, she's of course emotional, because in those days you wouldn't travel and move cities. It was very, very rare. Something would be wrong if you were to travel and leave one city and go to another city, because your tribe was everything. In Arabia, your tribe was your life. If you left your tribe and you traveled to another city, you could basically be killed and nothing would happen to you, because you don't have the protection anymore. Your tribe was everything. If you abandoned your tribe, you're exposed to death. It's like your nationality, basically. Those days, your status in terms of your power and how protected you are in the world was based on your tribe in Arabia in those days. So leaving was a big deal. And it also meant that the Quraysh weren't taking care of their own people, that they had to leave. Why are you leaving? Or because there's persecution. Why are your own people persecuting you? Other Arabs couldn't understand this, because your tribe should be taking care of you. You're leaving, you're abandoning your own tribes. So he said, "Where are you going?" And she became very emotional, very upset and angry. She said, "We're leaving because you people are persecuting us, you're killing us, you won't let us worship Allah, so we're making our way to Abyssinia." And Umar ibn Khattab looks at her and he says, "Sahibukum Allah, may Allah be with you." And he just walks away. And she's thinking, what's going on here? Sahibukum Allah, may Allah be with you. This is Umar ibn Khattab. Like, she was half expecting him to respond and start shouting back and maybe, say some words, in kind, serves you right and you shouldn't be doing this and you're from the Quraysh, etc. And he says, "May Allah be with you," and just walks away. Almost as if he feels sorry for them, as if he feels some sympathy. And the woman's husband comes back and she tells him the story that Umar ibn Khattab came to me and I was angry and I was packing and I said to him, "We're leaving because of you." And he asked me why we're leaving, and he said, "Sahibukum Allah, do you think maybe he might become Muslim?" And her husband says, "Umar ibn Khattab, become a Muslim. The donkey of his father will be Muslim before he ever becomes a Muslim. No chance he's going to accept Islam." Like, this is Umar you're talking about. But of course, slowly he's showing sympathy now towards Islam, towards the Muslims. He's realizing what's happening. And there's a level of respect there, the sacrifices that are being made by the Muslims. And the final story is when Umar ibn Khattab, one day, he leaves his house and he wants to look for the Prophet ﷺ to cause him harm. Let me just, go out, look for him and mess around, cause him some harm. And he says, "I went out one night," and some narrations mention he went out to look for alcohol. He couldn't find any alcohol, so he went to the Kaaba and he saw the Prophet ﷺ there. And he said, فَدَخَلْتُ فِي أَسْتَارِ الْكَعْبَةِ. So I went under the curtains of the Kaaba, the cloth of the Kaaba, the kiswa. They used to have cloth around the Kaaba in those days also. He said, "I went under the cloth of the Kaaba and the Prophet ﷺ was praying. And I could hear him reciting. And the Prophet ﷺ was praying on the other side of the Kaaba and I could hear him. And فَصَلَّى مَا شَاءَ اللَّهِ, he was reciting whatever Allah willed. And I could hear some of what he was reciting. And Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anh, he could hear the Prophet ﷺ reciting from Surah Haqqa. And towards the end, he's listening and listening, he's mesmerized, and he's realizing this is something different. Then he says to himself, "This is poetry. This is just poetry. It has to be poetry. It's just a fancy type of poetry." The next ayah the Prophet ﷺ recites, وَمَا هُوَ بِقَوْلِ شَاعِرٍ. And these aren't the words of a poet. And now Umar's thinking, what's going on? Like, does he know I'm here? Does he know I'm listening? Does he know I'm around hiding by the Kaaba? Maybe he can read minds. Maybe he's a soothsayer. The next ayah Allah says, وَلَا بِقَوْلِ كَاهِنٍ. And these aren't the words of a soothsayer. Almost like as if Allah is speaking to Umar radiallahu anhu through the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And so Umar radiallahu anhu kind of freaks out. And he's mesmerized by the beauty of the Quran. And he doesn't cause any harm to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and he just makes his way back home. And sometime later, Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anhu, he's with some of his friends. Narrations mention that they're discussing this problem of the Muslims. Someone should do something. Maybe someone should go and kill the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. No, we can't do this. If we do this, then there's going to be problems. His tribe, Banu Hashim, they'll get revenge. Umar ibn Khattab, he says, you know what? This is what I'm going to do. Why didn't I think of this before? I'll just go and kill this man, and it's job done. He says, I'll do it. And they said, but if you do this, then you're going to be killed. And he says, so be it. If I'm killed, then I'm killed. At least we won't have this problem anymore. If it means I have to sacrifice my life, I'll sacrifice my life. It shows his sacrifice. And it's something which, of course, the Muslims benefited from when he became Muslim. So he takes his sword and he starts making his way to the house of the Prophet ﷺ. And on the way, he meets a man. As we said, when he would walk with purpose. And he has a sword unsheathed in his hand. Having a sword in those days was like, maybe having a knife nowadays, or a gun in some places. You're walking with a purpose, like what's going on. So this man, he was a secret Muslim. No one knew he was a Muslim. And he realized there's something going on here. Umar's got a sword. This is a problem. He says, where are you going? He says, I'm going to kill Muhammad. I've had enough of this. If I kill him, it's all over. We'll be done with this. And the man, he had to think of something to say to prevent him from going to kill the Prophet ﷺ. And all he could think of was the fact that the second Khalifa, the future second Khalifa, Umar radiallahu anh, his sister was actually already a Muslim. Her name was Fatima. And she was married to Sa'id ibn Zayd. Who was Sa'id ibn Zayd again? The son of one of the Hunafa who would worship Allah before Islam. So he says, what about your sister? And he says, what about my sister? He said, do you not know? She's accepted Islam along with her husband, Sa'id. And Umar radiallahu anh, you can imagine his position in society amongst the Quraysh. How do you think he felt? Furious and also embarrassed. Like, you don't know. What do you mean? Your own sister is a Muslim. And he's supposed to be the representative of the Quraysh, doesn't even know his own sister is a Muslim. So you can imagine the fury and the embarrassment. So straight away he starts making his way towards Fatima radiallahu anha's house. And he starts making his way there. As he gets closer to the door, he can hear them reciting. And they were with another companion by the name of Khabbab. And Khabbab was teaching them the Quran. He had a scroll, a parchment, on it was the Quran, Surah Taha. And they're reciting, he can hear the recitation, he starts slamming on the door. And they hide the parchment, Khabbab hides in the closet. Fatima opens the door, he rushes in. He says, what are these words that I was just hearing? I could hear you guys reading something. Fatima says, I don't know what you're talking about, we weren't reading anything. And he's getting angry and angry. He said, don't lie, I know you've become Muslim. Sa'id radiallahu anh tries to step in between them to prevent him from, tries to calm him down. And he starts beating Sa'id up. Starts beating him senseless. And Fatima radiallahu anha tries to prevent him. And he starts beating up Fatima also. And then Fatima starts shouting back and says, yes, we've become Muslim, there's nothing you can do. We have accepted Islam and there's nothing you can do about it, we'll never leave Islam. And this was her response. And of course, she's the sister of Umar, so you can understand she'll probably have a similar personality. She's like, you're not going to do anything to us. Like, we're not going to leave Islam. Do whatever you want. And Umar radiallahu anh realizes what he's done. A fit of anger. He's caused harm to his sister, his brother-in-law. And he starts feeling bad for them. Starts feeling sorry for what he's done. So he calms down and he says, show me what you were reading. And Fatima radiallahu anha, what was she thinking? Was she thinking, this is a good thing. Here, read this. Maybe you'll become Muslim. She says, no. She says, you're dirty. Go and perform ghusl and then come back. Then I'll give you the parchment. I'm not going to give it to you. You're not even a Muslim. So he purifies himself. He comes back. She gives him the parchment. The second ayah of the surah What does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala say? Subhanallah, Allah says, طَاهَ مَا أَنزَلْنَا عَلَيْكَ الْقُرْآنَ لِتَشْقَى. We have not sent down the Qur'an for it to be a burden or a difficulty or to give you anxiety in this world. This Qur'an isn't supposed to stress you out. Meaning it's supposed to be a means of guidance. It's supposed to open your eyes to the truth. And of course, all this time, Umar radiallahu anhu has been feeling stressed. Just annoyed about the Muslims and about their beliefs and about the Quran that's being sent down to the Prophet ﷺ or that he's reciting. And maybe he's making up from Umar's perspective. He doesn't know it's from Allah. So as soon as he starts reading this surah, it's like again as if, subhanAllah, when you start reading Quran and you start coming across ayat, it's like as if Allah is talking to you. The Quran is a means of guidance. A person can read the Quran and Allah will guide a person through whatever he's reciting. This is the beauty of the Quran. And so Umar radiallahu anhu, his whole demeanor changes. And he says to Fatima radiallahu anha, tell me where the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam is. I want to go and see him. And she's like hesitant, like, what are you talking about? He says, don't worry, I don't want to cause him harm. And they realize that maybe he's close to accepting Islam. And that's when Khabbab comes out, because he was hiding all this time. He comes out and he says, have glad tidings, O Umar. Verily I heard the Prophet ﷺ say, O Allah, guide one of the two people who is more beloved to you, Umar or Abu Jahl. And I think this is what's happening to you. So Umar radiallahu anhu, with the same sword in his hand, makes his way to the house of the Messenger of Allah alayhi salatu wasalam. He knocks on the door. There are companions inside the house. One of them looks through the hole and he sees Umar radiallahu anhu on the outside. He turns around. Of course, you can understand he's got a sword in his hand. He doesn't know what's been happening with Umar over the last few hours. And so he turns and the companions are watching him and he's like pale in the face. And they're like, what's happened? What's wrong? He says, Umar outside. Umar is outside. And Hamza radiallahu anhu was already a Muslim. And he's also in the house. And of course, Hamza radiallahu anhu was also known for his bravery. And he says, so what if it's Umar? What's the problem? Like, there's so many of us in this house. We'll open the door, we'll bring him in. If he tries anything, there's loads of us here to overpower him. No problem. So they open the door, they bring him inside. And the Prophet ﷺ walks up to Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anhu, grabs him and starts shaking him. And the Prophet ﷺ was a tall person, but not that tall. They say the Prophet ﷺ was neither tall nor short, but he was more on the taller side. So we don't have obviously measurements. There were no 6 feet 10 inches in those days. We don't have measurements, but we know he was taller rather than shorter. So, he was somebody who was taller rather than shorter. Umar radiallahu anhu was very tall, and he was big. Like he had a big build, very built. And Umar radiallahu anhu, he says that the Prophet ﷺ shook me, and no one had ever shaken me like that before. I could feel his strength. I could feel his grip. And that shows you the strength and the bravery of the Prophet ﷺ. And they say that the Prophet ﷺ had the strength of 30 men. So in battle, the companions, when the going got tough, they would go by the Prophet ﷺ because they knew how strong he was. So Umar radiallahu anhu said, I've never been shaken like this. And so he shook him and he said, Oh Umar, when are you going to accept Islam? And this again is very interesting because, we're told about the importance of softness when it comes to giving, da'wah and calling people to Islam. But this isn't really softness. He literally just grabbed him and shook him and said, when are you going to become Muslim? And it shows us sometimes da'wah needs to be specific depending on who you're calling to, or who you're calling towards Islam. Certain people, maybe softness is the way. For other people, maybe they have to have this rough and tough approach towards them sometimes, on rare occasions. Sometimes it's what's needed. When you want somebody to snap out of something. Sometimes you might see somebody going crazy or losing it and they slap them. Snap out of it and they'll slap them on the face. Why do they do that? Because in certain situations, I'm not saying you should slap people, I'm just saying, sometimes you have to wake somebody up. You need those desperate, measures. And so he shook him. Umar radiallahu an, after he was told this by the Prophet ﷺ, said, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa ashhadu anna Muhammadur Rasulullah. And the companions were shocked. They were so happy, amazed. And he started making takbir. And Umar radiallahu an had become a Muslim. And the companions, they said that Islam was given honor through Umar ibn Khattab and through Hamza radiallahu an. Umar ibn Khattab was the one that when he became Muslim, the Muslims were given honor through Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu an. Because when he became Muslim, narrations mention they left in two rows. One row led by Hamza, one row led by Umar radiallahu anhuma. And they went towards the Kaaba and they prayed by the Kaaba, and the people were shocked, like, what's going on? Umar has become a Muslim. And they wouldn't harm any of the Muslims because Umar was there. Because they were afraid that they might be harmed by Umar radiallahu an. Other narrations mention Umar ibn Khattab, when he left the house after he became Muslim, he wanted to tell everybody that he was a Muslim. He was like, I'm not hiding anything. I want everyone to know. And he said that he went to Abu Jahl's house himself. Knocked on the house of Abu Jahl, on the door of the house of Abu Jahl. Abu Jahl opens the door. He says, I've become Muslim. I want to tell you I've become Muslim. Abu Jahl is furious, but doesn't say anything. Just closes the door, slams the door in his face. And Umar radiallahu anhu is thinking, that's it. I was thinking he might say some more or try to fight or something. So he goes around looking for other people to tell them that he's a Muslim. And he finds a man, this man, his name was Jamil. And this person, he was like a walking radio in those days. What does that mean? Meaning he loved gossip. If you wanted the latest gossip, he was a guy you go to. He had the latest gossip about everybody. This person done this, and he did this, and then she did that, and did you hear about this person? You go to him, he was the guy who had all the news and all the juicy gossip. He sees him and he says, this guy's perfect. So he says to him, I've become a Muslim. As soon as Jamil hears, he shoots up, starts running and starts shouting to everybody. Umar's become Muslim, Umar's become Muslim. Umar's left the way of the Quraysh. And the people start slowly approaching Umar ibn Khattab, trying to find out, is this true, what's going on? And there's more and more people gathering around Umar radiallahu anh. He's responding to them. Yes, I've become Muslim. They're raising their voices. There's more and more of a crowd. Soon the voices start to be raised. Eventually it becomes physical, and they start fighting Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anh. You're talking maybe 20, 30 people, all fighting Umar radiallahu anh. And he's trying to fight back. And this is the kind of person Umar radiallahu anh was. And then one elderly man comes and stops them and says, you fools, don't you know what you're doing? Do you know who this is? This is Umar radiallahu anh. What do you think is going to happen if you kill him? His tribe is going to attack your tribe. You're going to be finished. You're going to cause a war to take place. Do you really want to, have a war at the hands of, as a result of you laying hands on Umar radiallahu anh? And so they start to disperse and they start to leave. And Umar radiallahu anh, this is how he accepted Islam, and this is how he became a Muslim in Mecca. And as we said, Islam was given honor through the Islam of Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu an. And this is the story of Umar radiallahu an's time in Mecca. Narrations also mention that he would tell the Quraysh, he would say, Wallahi, if we had just 300 men, we would fight you. And what's very interesting is at the Battle of Badr, there were just over 300 men. So it was like as if he had this firasa, this ability to, know about certain aspects of the future. And this was a science in those days. It was called ilm al-firasa, specifically about people also. Umar radiallahu anhu, one of the things that he was also blessed with was this firasa. You could call it acumen. They also call it physiognomy. It's an old science that doesn't exist anymore. Physiognomy is the science of looking at a person and knowing the personality of that person, and maybe even where he came from and what he does as a job, etc., etc., just by looking at them. And Umar radiallahu anhu had this. There's a story which is mentioned about a man who came to Medina, And Umar radiallahu anhu said, this man, he's either a soothsayer or he's somebody who's an evil person. There's something not right with this person. Just by looking at him, doesn't even know him. The man came, he started questioning him. He said, who are you? And he told him who he was. And he said, he said, I'm a Muslim. He said, what were you before you became Muslim? He said, I used to be a soothsayer. So Umar radiallahu had this gift, and there's other stories about his firasa, him being able to ascertain and judge. He was a good judge of character. He could tell a person's personality and maybe his background, his job, etc., just by looking at them. And this was a science that actually the scholars would also learn. The scholars of Islam in the early days, they would actually study this science from other people, from other scholars. The very interesting story of Imam Shafi'i. He went to somebody to study ilm al-firasa, the science of acumen, physiognomy, learning about people, and if you see a person like this, it means he's like this, etc. And he left, Imam Shafi'i left, and he encountered a man when he went to a small town, and this man was so hospitable towards him. Took him to his house, gave him food, a place to stay, being so nice to him. And Imam Shafi'i, he said, everything I studied showed me that this person was actually a bad person. Like, everything I've been taught, basically, it feels like it's wrong. Because he's being so nice, he's such a hospitable person, he's supposed to be a bad person based on what I've studied. And so he's there for a number of days, and he says to himself, when I leave this place, I'm going to take all my notes, I'm going to burn them. Because the guy was wrong, like my teacher was wrong, he had no idea, he doesn't know what he's talking about. So he gives him a riding beast, and he starts walking with him towards the outskirts of the city before he continues his journey. And Imam Shafi, he thanks him, he says, may Allah reward you, etc., etc. The man says, where are you going? He says, I'm going now, I'm leaving. So I'm just thanking you for all the efforts you made, may Allah reward you. He says, what do you think, I did this for free? I want some money. Like, I wasn't doing this for free, I need some money, some compensation for what I've been doing for the past 3 days. And Imam Shafi realizes, okay, everything that I was taught actually was correct. And Umar radiallahu anhu, the point is, also had this. And of course, as a result of his Islam, he would spend time learning from the Prophet ﷺ. But it's interesting, we just assume all the companions just sat there and stayed with the Prophet all day. But of course, they used to work. They had to make a living. So what Umar radiallahu anhu, for example, would do, and others would also do the same, he had a friend of his, and what they would do is they would take turns, they would alternate. One day, Umar radiallahu anhu would go to make a living and do whatever he needed to do for the house and family, etc., and work business. And his friend would stay with the Prophet ﷺ, and then at the end of the day, he would tell him what he had learnt. And in the second day, Umar radiallahu anhu would stay with the Prophet ﷺ, and then of course, he would tell his friend what he had learned for that second day, and they would alternate. And of course, Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anhu was one of the most staunchest supporters of Islam and the Muslims, and he was one of the closest friends of the Prophet ﷺ. And it's very interesting how you look at the personalities of these close companions. Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, known for his soft nature, but he could be stern in some situations. So Umar ibn Khattab, very, very strict and harsh and stern. Uthman radiallahu anhu, known for his shyness and modesty. Ali radiallahu anhu, a gifted warrior, a very wise man, a young companion compared to the others. Different personalities, but they were very close to each other. And Umar radiallahu anhu, even though he was somebody who was an enemy of Islam, look how he rose through the ranks and became the second leader of the Muslims. And that also shows us you don't have to be from a respectable family, for example, or have any high position to be somebody who is raised up in the ranks in the eyes of Allah and in the eyes of the people. If a person has strong iman, belief in Allah, and is somebody who speaks up for Islam and the Muslims, and calls people to the worship of Allah and isn't afraid, Allah will raise that person's ranks. Allah will guide him and give him a higher status than maybe other people if he has belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's why the companions, they would say so many times, we would hear people say, I saw the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam with Abu Bakr and Umar radiallahu anhu. I saw Abu Bakr, Umar, I saw the Prophet sallallahu Abu Bakr and Umar. They came to me, The Prophet ﷺ with Abu Bakr and Umar. The Prophet ﷺ stopped in this place, and with him were Abu Bakr and Umar radiallahu anh. And it was always in that order, interestingly. So again, it shows us the status of the companions and how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can guide whomsoever He wishes. This person, you wouldn't have thought that he would be from the Muslims in those days, when he was persecuting the Muslims because of their belief. But Allah guided him. And it shows us Allah can guide whomsoever He wants. يَهْدِ اللَّهُ مَنْ يَشَاءُ. Allah guides whomsoever He wishes. And this is the favors of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And inshallah we'll conclude here, and we're going to continue next time with the life of Umar ibn Khattab past or post Hijrah, inshallah. Any questions before we conclude? جزاكم الله خير. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله